Johnny Carson was midway through his Tonight Show monologue when a guest waiting in the green room began crying uncontrollably. What Johnny did next brought live television to a halt and left 20 million viewers deeply moved. It was Tuesday, March 15, 1978, at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. Johnny Carson stood center stage, delivering his trademark opening monologue to a studio audience and millions watching at home. He was in perfect form, joking about President Carter's recent speech and California's unpredictable weather. The show was running seamlessly. Ed McMahon had just finished his booming introduction. Doc Severinsen's band played flawlessly, and Johnny's timing, as always, was sharp. But behind the curtain in the green room, something profoundly emotional was unfolding. Something that would soon change how live television handled human moments. Earlier that day, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher named Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the studio. She had recently won a small contest that earned her a guest spot on the show. The plan was simple, a short interview about her creative teaching techniques that had been featured in a local paper. Sarah seemed like the perfect uplifting guest, a dedicated educator from a small Ohio town who had transformed how children with learning difficulties learned to read. Producers loved her story. It was inspiring, positive, and promised to give Johnny an easy, feel-good segment. What no one knew, however, was that Sarah Mitchell was living with a devastating secret. Just 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Her doctor had told her she had less than 6 months to live. She hadn't told anyone, not her students, not her co-workers, not even her aging parents living across the country. For Sarah, appearing on The Tonight Show was more than just a fun opportunity. It was her quiet farewell to the world, a way to leave behind something meaningful before her time ran out. As she sat in the green room watching Johnny's monologue on the monitor, something he said struck her deeply. Johnny made a lighthearted joke about how teachers rarely get the credit they deserve. Teachers, Johnny said with his familiar grin, they're the real stars. They take kids who can barely tie their shoes and turn them into doctors, lawyers, and maybe even talk show hosts who don't deserve half the attention they get. The audience laughed, but Sarah felt a sudden ache in her chest. She thought about her students, about little Tommy, who had just learned to read after months of struggle. She thought of her students, Amy, who had overcome her stutter, and Marcus, who had gone from failing grades to the top of his class. Then came the painful realization. She would never see them graduate, never know if her teaching methods would continue to change young lives. The thought overwhelmed her. What started as quiet tears quickly turned into uncontrollable sobbing. Fred de Cordova, the show's director, was watching the green room feed when he noticed Sarah breaking down. His initial reaction was purely professional. They had only 5 minutes until her segment, and a crying guest could disrupt the upbeat rhythm of the show. "We've got a situation," Fred whispered into his headset. "The teacher is having some kind of breakdown. We might need to cut her segment," but as Fred kept watching, something stopped him. This wasn't the nervous crying of a guest overwhelmed by being on TV. It was something far deeper. The pain of someone silently carrying a heavy burden. Realizing this, Fred made a decision that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Instead of removing Sarah from the lineup, he decided to inform Johnny Carson directly. As Johnny was midway through a joke about California drivers, a stage assistant quietly approached and handed him a folded note, something unheard of during a live broadcast. At first, Johnny looked confused, then slightly concerned. Still smiling for the audience, he opened the paper. It read, "Johnny, urgent. Our next guest is crying in the green room. This isn't stage fright, she's in real distress. You might want to check in." Johnny Carson had been doing live television for over 15 years. He had seen it all. Technical failures, unruly guests, on-air blunders, even power outages. But he had never been handed a note like this. Without breaking rhythm, Johnny wrapped up his joke, waited for the laughter to settle, and then calmly did something unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone suddenly sincere, "we need to pause for just a moment. We'll be right back after this message." Then, he quietly signaled for a commercial break. Something that wasn't supposed to happen for another 10 minutes happened early. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, Johnny Carson did something that surprised everyone on his team. He stepped away from his desk, walked past the curtain, and made his way directly to the green room. "Johnny, what are you doing?" called out Fred de Cordova, the show's director. "We've still got a show to finish." "The show can wait," Johnny replied calmly without looking back. "Someone needs help." Johnny Carson, who was known for keeping a professional distance from guests before interviews, quietly opened the green room door. Inside, Sarah Mitchell sat alone, tears streaming down her face as she tried to pull herself together. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said quickly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know what's come over me. I'll be fine for the interview, I promise." Johnny sat down across from her, not as a television host, but as a person showing genuine care. "What's really going on?" he asked softly. For a brief moment, Sarah tried to hold her composure. She began repeating the same explanation she'd given everyone, that she was simply nervous about being on national television. But something about Johnny's presence stopped her. His tone, his patience, and the kindness in his expression made it clear he wasn't looking at her as a guest on his show, but as someone who mattered. Her defenses finally broke. "I'm dying," Sarah whispered, so softly that Johnny had to lean closer to hear her. "I have cancer, 6 months, maybe less. I came here because I wanted to do something meaningful before I go. I want people to understand that teachers matter, that what we do truly matters." Her words hung in the air between them. Johnny Carson, a man known for his perfect timing and sharp wit, found himself completely speechless. Outside the green room, the Tonight Show crew was growing uneasy. They had already been in a commercial break for 3 minutes, an unusually long time in live television. Network executives were beginning to call the control room, but inside that quiet space, Johnny Carson was making a decision that would not only define that night's show but also become a lasting part of his legacy. "Sarah," Johnny said finally, "would you be willing to share that story on the show? Not about your illness. That can stay private if you'd like, but the part about why teaching matters. I think people need to hear it." Sarah looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "But I'm a mess," she said quietly. "This isn't how I wanted to appear." Johnny gave a small, genuine smile, not his polished on-camera one, but something real. "Sometimes," he said, "the most meaningful conversations happen when we stop trying to be perfect." When the Tonight Show returned from the break, something had clearly shifted. Johnny sat at his desk, but his tone was calmer and more sincere than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'd like to bring out our next guest. But before I do, I want to share something. A few minutes ago, I met someone backstage who reminded me why I love what I do, and why some jobs are far more important than mine." The audience sensed the change and fell silent. "Our next guest is an elementary school teacher from Ohio," Johnny continued. "She's here tonight not for fame, but to speak on behalf of the heroes we often overlook. Please welcome Sarah Mitchell." Sarah Mitchell walked onto the Tonight Show stage, her tears still visible, but her composure returning with each step. She walked onto the stage with a quiet grace and strength that everyone could feel. The audience, instead of breaking into their usual loud applause, greeted her with a calm and respectful welcome. Johnny didn't begin with his typical lighthearted banter. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah and asked, "Tell us, why did you become a teacher?" What followed was unlike any Tonight Show interview before or after. Sarah spoke about her students with such genuine care and emotion that her voice trembled several times. She mentioned Tommy, a student with dyslexia who had learned to read by connecting letters with colors. Then there was Amy, who had overcome her stutter by learning to sing her words before speaking them. But above all, Sarah spoke about the moment she realized that teaching wasn't just a profession, it was a calling. A purpose built on helping children recognize that they were capable of far more than they believed. Halfway through the conversation, Johnny asked her about her personal teaching philosophy. Sarah's reply was simple yet deeply meaningful. "I tell my students that everyone has something special inside them," she said. "My job isn't to put it there. It's to help them find it and believe in it." Then she paused, turned toward the camera, and spoke directly to the viewers watching at home. "If you're watching this," she said softly, "and you're a student who's struggling in school, if you're someone who's ever been told you're not smart enough or not good enough," Sarah said, "I want you to know that you are enough. You have something special inside you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Her voice broke on the final words and tears began to fall. But this time, They weren't from sadness. They came from the deep emotion of knowing she was speaking to millions of children who needed to hear her message. Johnny Carson, who had spoken with thousands of guests over his long career, found himself tearing up on live television. What happened next had never taken place in the history of The Tonight Show. Johnny rose from behind his desk, walked across the stage and gently hugged Sarah, not as a host comforting a guest, but as one person moved by another's honesty and courage. The audience didn't cheer or applaud. Instead, the studio remained completely silent, a rare and powerful moment of shared empathy witnessed by millions at home. When Johnny finally spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I've been doing this show for 16 years. I've talked with actors, politicians, comedians, just about every kind of celebrity you can imagine. But what you just heard tonight is more meaningful than anything any of them, including me, have ever said on this stage." After the broadcast ended, Johnny did something else he had never done before. He asked Sarah Mitchell to stay behind for a private conversation in his dressing room. It was there that Sarah shared her diagnosis with him, for the first time. She explained that appearing on The Tonight Show was her way of making her life meaningful, way to ensure her voice would continue to be heard even after she was gone. Johnny listened quietly, giving her his full attention. When Sarah finished, he made a promise he would keep for the rest of his life. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that tonight you didn't just speak to 20 million people. You touched 20 million hearts, and I'll make sure your message lives on long after tonight." True to his word, Johnny Carson began something that would shape the remainder of his career. From that night forward, he regularly featured teachers, social workers, nurses, and other everyday heroes on The Tonight Show, giving them the same respect and platform usually reserved for celebrities. But even more meaningful was what he did privately. Johnny quietly created a foundation dedicated to supporting innovative teaching programs for children with learning challenges. The first grant from this foundation went toward expanding Sarah Mitchell's teaching methods to classrooms nationwide. Johnny never spoke about the foundation on television and never used it for personal recognition. His goal was simple: to make sure Sarah's work continued to impact lives. Sarah Mitchell lived for 11 months after her appearance on the show, 5 months longer than doctors had predicted. During that time, she traveled across the country, visiting schools and training educators to apply her methods. Sarah spent her remaining months sharing her teaching approach with other educators and spreading her message of hope to thousands of children. When she passed away in February 1979, she was surrounded by her former students, colleagues, and educators whose lives she had touched. Among the many floral tributes at her funeral was a simple bouquet with a card that read, "Thank you for reminding me why this matters." That particular Tonight Show episode became well known among television professionals, but was difficult to access for many years. Johnny Carson had requested NBC to restrict reruns, believing Sarah's story was too personal and meaningful to be treated as regular entertainment. Still, unofficial copies of the interview quietly circulated within the education community for decades. Teachers would play it for their students as an example of how one person's dedication could make a lasting difference. Education programs even used it as a case study on the powerful influence teachers can have. In 1992, during his farewell episode of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson mentioned Sarah Mitchell in his closing remarks. 16 years ago, he said, "A teacher from Ohio reminded me that the most important conversations aren't always the funniest. Some stories are too meaningful for jokes. Sarah, if you're listening, thank you for showing me what truly matters." Today, the Johnny Carson Foundation for Educational Innovation continues to support programs that help children with learning challenges. Inside its headquarters hangs a photo from that March night in 1978, Johnny Carson embracing Sarah Mitchell on stage. Beneath it, a plaque displays her words, "Everyone has something special within them. Our job is to help them discover it and believe in it." To date, the foundation has assisted more than 50,000 children with learning disabilities, trained thousands of teachers in innovative techniques, and supported research that has transformed how we understand and assist struggling learners. The night Johnny Carson paused live television for a tearful guest became a pivotal moment, not only for The Tonight Show but for the medium itself. It revealed that audiences wanted more than entertainment. They wanted genuine human connection. Inspired by Carson, Other talk show hosts began using their platforms to spotlight real-world issues and everyday heroes. This approach, using fame to elevate meaningful voices, soon became a new television standard. But most importantly, that night demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is simply listen. In a later interview, Johnny reflected on that moment. "I used to think my job was to make people laugh. Sarah taught me that my job is also to make people think, to make them feel, and to remind them of what really matters." Even today, whenever a host uses their platform to highlight important causes or give a voice to someone who might not otherwise be heard, they are carrying forward the legacy Johnny Carson began that night in 1978, the night he chose compassion over entertainment. Sarah Mitchell came to The Tonight Show to talk about teaching. Instead, she ended up teaching an entire nation, and Johnny Carson himself, a lesson that would endure for generations. If this story of empathy and genuine human connection inspired you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more real stories about the heart behind entertainment's greatest legends. Share this video with a teacher who's made a difference in your life, and tell us in the comments about a moment when someone's kindness left a lasting impact.